Hey everybody, Professor Benelou here with the second of 3 short videos discussing Unit 2 discussion board. In this short video, I will be going over the first 3 topics that you can cover. There's 6 of them in total. So in this video, I'll be going over the Bay of Pigs invasion, I'll be going over the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Vietnam War protests. Okay, so let's start out with the Bay of Pigs invasion. The primary document that you can analyze for this is a letter written by Presidential Advisor Richard N. Goodwin to President Kennedy in 1961 regarding the Bay of Pigs. So let me give you some background information on the Bay of Pigs invasion, which occurred in 1961. So to understand this, you got to understand that in 1959, the Cuban Revolution ended with Fidel Castro coming to power in Havana and installing a communist government. Okay. The plans for the Bay of Pigs invasion were actually formulated with the CIA during the Eisenhower administration. But President Eisenhower, who was president from 1953 to 1961, did not have enough time to put the plan in motion before he left office. So President John F. Kennedy, our 35th president of the United States, inherited the Bay of Pigs invasion when he took office in January of 1961. What had occurred is the CIA had trained Cuban exiles to invade Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. And the hope was that when the exiles landed and started invading Cuba, the Cuban citizens would join the exiles in ousting Castro. This did not end up happening, and we'll get into that. April 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred. The U.S. government had promised the exiles 2 airstrikes. The first airstrike was pretty disastrous, and basically the involvement of the U.S. government was revealed. So President Kennedy canceled the second airstrike. About 1,200 exiles were imprisoned and 100 were killed during this fiasco that is now known as the Bay of Pigs. President Kennedy had to negotiate for the release of the imprisoned exiles. So it's a pretty scary incident in our history. Okay, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The primary document that you will be analyzing in this topic is a YouTube video of President Kennedy addressing the nation regarding the Bay of Pigs invasion. I'll give you a little background information on the Cuban Missile Crisis so you can better understand this topic. October 1962, about 18 months after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, U.S. military planes photographed nuclear missile sites being constructed in Cuba by the Soviet Union. Kennedy had 2 options in regarding to responding to this information. Number 1, order an invasion of Cuba, which 18 months after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, maybe not so much. And secondly, place a naval blockade against Cuba. The Kennedy administration chose a naval blockade against Cuba because it was very much feared that invasion would lead to intervention by the Soviet Union. Negotiations during the Cuban Missile Crisis lasted a very tense 13 days. And it was the closest that the United States has ever come to nuclear war. It's interesting because the Kennedys famously had a estate in Palm Beach, Florida. And not far from Palm Beach, Florida is a place called Peanut Island. It's right there. And on Peanut Island, they had a nuclear bunker set up for President Kennedy and his family. Very interesting. You used to be able to tour it, but it makes me so sad. I'm heartbroken. Because they let it go in disrepair and they stopped the tours. So anyway, but interesting. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the president's brother, wrote of his experience as a cabinet member during this crisis within his famous book, 13 Days, and it became a movie, made into a movie as well. The Soviets removed the missiles from Cuba in exchange for the U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. But what I find fascinating, what was not really known to the American public until recent history, is that in exchange for the Soviets removing the missiles from Cuba, we agreed to remove our missiles from Turkey and Greece. So I find that fascinating because, kids growing up in the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis were always taught, well, darn it, we stared down the Soviets and they blinked and they took away their missiles. They got rid of those missiles. So it's really interesting. It's kind of an even-Steven exchange there. But anyway. Okay, so the third topic and the last one I will be going over in this video is the Vietnam War protests. The primary document you will be dealing with if you choose this topic is John Kerry's speech in front of a congressional committee, April 23rd, 1971. John Kerry served as U.S. Senator from Massachusetts from 1985 to 2013, and he was the Democratic Party's nominee for president in 2004. He served as our Secretary of State under President Obama between 2013, and 2017. But from 1966 until 1970, he served as a lieutenant in the United States Navy fighting in Vietnam. And of course, he gave this famous speech April 23rd, 1971 in front of Congress. He was very disillusioned through his service in Vietnam, and this led him to join a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Vietnam Veterans Against the War was formed in 1967 and was basically made up of Vietnam veterans who had come home and were now completely against the war. So Kerry was chosen to give this incredible speech before a congressional committee on behalf of this organization, April 23rd, 1971. Okay, that will be it for this second video. In the last video, the third video, I'll be going over the women's rights movement, the Chicano rights movement, and the Black Power movement. See you in a little bit.